I'm part of a volunteer search and recovery team. Each year, we participate in a late summer retreat filled with activities to build teamwork and improve our skills. One of the exercises involves night training, which is exactly what it sounds like, honing our ability to search for and assist in rescues after dark. My specific role is K9 recovery specialist, which is how I got involved in the first place. I've always loved working with animals, but never had the academic credentials to pursue veterinary medicine. Joining this team as a dog handler gave me the perfect balance of meaningful volunteer work and spending time with dogs. And while playing with the dogs might not be entirely accurate, you get the general idea. On one particular night exercise, my dog, trained to detect traces of human remains, alerted us to a scent. I was partnered with a more experienced team member at the time. When I glanced at her for guidance, she simply said, "Let's see where it leads." Now, you might wonder why we weren't immediately panicking when the dog picked up a scent of remains. The explanation is straightforward. Even highly trained cadaver dogs can sometimes be mistaken, especially in a damp environment like Oregon, where it rains heavily and consistently. Wet conditions can confuse scent trails. Our approach was to let the dog follow the trail. Either it would turn out to be a false alarm, or, in the worst-case scenario, we'd discover previously unidentified remains. While the latter might sound grim, it's a central part of what we do. The senior member and I decided to temporarily split up. She waited on the main path while I followed my dog into the woods. Both of us assumed it was likely a false alert and figured we'd be back on course within a few minutes. However, those minutes stretched into 10 as my dog led me deeper into the forest, and then down a steep embankment. That's when I lost my footing and tumbled hard. I landed awkwardly, my chest blazing with pain, likely from fractured ribs, and blood dripping down the side of my face where I'd hit a rock. My first move was to activate the emergency alert on my GPS, notifying the base team that I needed help. My second instinct was to call for my dog, Max, who had bolted during my fall, likely spooked by the sudden commotion or still pursuing the scent he'd found. Lying there in pain, disoriented and unable to see well after dropping my flashlight during the fall, I shouted Max's name, hoping he'd come back to me. I was also counting on the base team to send help quickly so I could get out of there. I have no idea how long I waited, but the sound of approaching footsteps eventually brought a surge of relief. I called out, assuming it was another team member. But when the person spoke, it wasn't anyone from my group. Their voice was unfamiliar, and the words they spoke sent a shiver through me. The man began talking, his tone casual but unsettling. He mentioned I had fallen into a dried streambed where accidents happen frequently. He claimed at least one person dies there every year, caught in sudden floods during the rainy season. His words felt eerie, like he took some strange satisfaction in recounting these tragedies. I begged him for help, but he ignored me, continuing his monologue about the dangers of the area. Frustrated and terrified, I demanded to know what was wrong with him. His chilling reply was something like, "You're not in a position to talk to me that way." At that point, I started shouting for help as loudly as I could, even though every scream made the stabbing pain in my chest worse. Then I heard Max. He's part border collie, part shepherd, and very expressive. His distinct whines and barks echoed closer and closer, and as soon as the stranger heard him, he stopped talking. Moments later, I heard the man's footsteps retreating into the darkness. Not long after, the sounds of multiple footsteps and flashlights surrounded me. My teammates had arrived. After they reached me, I wasted no time telling them about the stranger. One of them swept the area with a flashlight, while another asked urgently, "Did he hurt you? Were you pushed?" Though I was terrified the man might have intended harm, I assured them he hadn't caused my fall. He seemed to have stumbled upon me afterward, or perhaps had been nearby all along. They stayed with me until medics arrived with an ATV to transport me back to base camp. From there, I was examined, stabilized, and driven to a small clinic where they confirmed I'd fractured ribs. Painkillers and rest were prescribed, and by the next morning, I felt well enough to share my experience with the rest of the team. Others had also reported seeing a strange man roaming the area that night, someone who wasn't part of our group. Concerned for safety, the team decided to change locations for future retreats. A second encounter with that unsettling figure wasn't a risk anyone was willing to take. Even now, thinking back to his eerie comments and the way he seemed almost pleased by the area's history of accidents sends a chill down my spine. My name is Alex, and I've been a fan of your channel for a while now. I live in Brisbane, Australia, and the story I'm about to share actually involves you and your videos, though in a rather indirect way. I met my girlfriend back in April 2018. She was the one who first introduced me to your channel. Honestly, at first, I thought it was odd that she liked listening to scary stories to relax, but after a while, I got used to it. Eventually, I even started to enjoy them too. We'd often play a video while we did the dishes after dinner. It became a bit of a tradition for us. Then, sometime in early March the following year, we were listening to one of your camping story compilations when my girlfriend suggested we visit a place called Currumbong Valley. Currumbong is about a 3.5-hour drive from Brisbane and is well known among hikers and campers. I know it probably sounds strange that listening to eerie camping stories would inspire us to go camping ourselves, but rural crime is so uncommon that we didn't feel there was any real danger. And truthfully, we weren't in any immediate danger, but what happened next was ironic in a pretty unsettling way. We made the trip to Currumbong and arrived on the 15th of March, 2019. We'd ordered some camping gear online and were searching for a good spot to set up our tent when we stumbled across another pair of campers. They were standing near a charred uda and what looked like the remains of a burned tent about 10 or so meters off the trail. It was a man and a woman, probably in their late 20s. The guy was pacing back and forth, talking urgently on his phone, while the woman stood nearby looking worried. At first, we thought they'd accidentally set their own campsite on fire, maybe a gas stove gone wrong or something like that, but it soon became clear that it wasn't their stuff at all. They'd just stumbled across it like we had. The man told us he was reporting the scene to the police because it looked recent. You could still smell the smoke lingering in the air. He also mentioned seeing some fresh supplies lying around, which suggested whoever had been there hadn't left long ago. Since the couple had already called the authorities, there wasn't much for us to do. We wished them luck and continued our hike, finding a nice spot a bit further away to set up camp. At the time, we didn't think much of it. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing that screamed foul play. It just looked like someone had an unfortunate accident. Fast forward a few days, and my girlfriend sent me a news article she'd seen online. The charred vehicle and tent we'd come across belonged to an older couple who'd gone camping in the same area. Tragically, they hadn't returned home and were now listed as missing persons. Police were asking for anyone with information to come forward, so we got in touch to share what little we knew. We spent 2 nights in the valley and didn't see or hear anything strange during our stay, aside from that one burned campsite. For a brief moment, we even wondered if the young couple we'd met might have had something to do with it. After all, we only had their word that they'd contacted the police. But the authorities assured us they'd already spoken extensively with the person who made the call, so we tried to put it out of our minds. About a year and a half later, the mystery was finally solved, but not in the way anyone had hoped. The bodies of the missing couple were found, and it turned out they hadn't been victims of an accident. They'd been murdered. Their campsite was burned to destroy evidence, and the killer had fled. Knowing we had unknowingly walked into the scene of a murder was deeply unsettling. According to investigators, the crime had taken place less than a day before we arrived. If we'd come earlier, we might have crossed paths with the killer or, worse, become targets ourselves. As details emerged, we learned the killings weren't random. They also weren't the result of some serial killer stalking the area. The whole thing had started over a dispute about a drone. The killer claimed there was an argument that escalated when one of the victims supposedly pointed a firearm at him. He said he acted in self-defense, disarmed the man, and then killed both him and his wife before burning their belongings and bodies to cover his tracks. The killer's trial was ongoing when I decided to share this story with you. His defense was trying to paint him as remorseful, saying he felt sick over what he'd done and even vomited from the smell while burning the evidence. Honestly, it's just disgusting. Anyway, I hope your channel continues to grow, and I wish you all the best. I can't stop thinking about how senseless this whole thing was. People losing their lives over something as trivial as a drone. It's truly awful. Back in 2010, I tried organizing a camping trip for myself and some buddies. All spring, they'd been hyping up the idea. Just a group of guys, no gadgets, soaking in nature and enjoying the moment. But as the date approached, each of the 4 guys bailed, citing one excuse after another. It was frustrating because I had been so excited for a wild adventure and had spent what felt like a fortune at the time on all the camping gear I thought I'd need. With everyone dropping out, the trip seemed doomed. Then it hit me, why not go alone? The trip was set for mid-July, the absolute best time to camp in the northern part of the region, and rescheduling would mean waiting another year for the same conditions. So, I decided to pack my stuff and head out solo for a few days of camping in a remote park in New England. The 3 days I spent out there turned out to be incredible. I had worried that going alone would leave me bored or restless, but it was the opposite. I was busy the entire time, setting up camp, gathering firewood, arranging the tripwire alarms, and building a fire. By the time the sun set, I was too exhausted to relax. Nighttime in the woods is unnerving, especially when it's your first time camping alone in over a decade. The sounds of the forest had me on edge, but I eventually adjusted and managed to sleep decently on the second and third nights. On the final night, though, I woke up in the middle of the night feeling very uncomfortable. Let's just say nature was calling after 3 days of avoiding the issue. The idea of squatting in the woods didn't appeal to me. Visions of snakes or creepy crawlies kept putting me off, but I'd reached the point of no return. I grabbed my headlamp, switched it to the dim blue light mode to avoid attracting attention, and ventured a short distance into the trees with some wet wipes. I found a spot, took care of business, and began heading back to camp. Just as I got within about 80 feet, I noticed a flashlight beam moving around my campsite. My heart raced. Someone else was there. While there were a few innocent explanations, my gut leaned towards something more sinister. Instead of walking directly back, I quickly turned off my headlamp and crouched behind a tree to observe. The person was shining their flashlight over my camp, seemingly inspecting it. Moments later, a second flashlight appeared, and now 2 people were moving around my campsite. They started talking quietly, and while I couldn't make out most of their words, I clearly heard one of them say, "He was just here." That sent chills down my spine. It's one thing for people to stumble upon a campsite by accident, but it's entirely different when they seem to have been watching you. My mind raced with questions. How had they approached my camp without setting off the trip alarms? What were they after? I stayed hidden, barely daring to breathe, as I watched them talk and eventually agree to come back tomorrow. Then they left. I remained frozen in place, debating my next move. I wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but that would mean making noise and using my headlamp, potentially revealing my position if they were nearby. I decided to stay put in the darkness, battling fear and overthinking every possibility. Finally, dawn broke, and I felt confident enough to return to my camp. I packed up as quickly and quietly as I could and skipped breakfast, heading straight back to my car. To avoid being predictable, I avoided the main trails and took a longer, less direct route. On the way out, I stopped by the park's information center to ask if any rangers had been patrolling the area at night. They hadn't. In fact, they said no ranger would ever approach a campsite in the middle of the night without announcing themselves. They encouraged me to file a report, which I did, but the experience left me shaken. Even though the trip was unforgettable, I haven't been able to bring myself to camp there again. Evergreen Woods Park was one of my most cherished spots growing up. I spent my childhood in a small town just outside of Wilmington, in a neighborhood called Maplewood. Some of you might have heard of the name, though not for the best reasons. I attended Maplewood High School, the same school as Aaron said and Hannah Lee, the same people whose lives were central to the infamous Clear Signal podcast. For those unfamiliar, Clear Signal was one of the first big true crime podcasts. It recounted how Aaron allegedly killed Hannah, his girlfriend at the time, a case that cast a dark shadow over Maplewood. Wilmington's reputation hadn't been great since the early 2000s, thanks in part to a gritty TV drama that aired during my middle school years. I used to feel a deep love for both the park and my hometown, often defending them fiercely in online gaming chats. But one day, something happened that changed my perspective forever. It was the day I vowed never to return to Evergreen Woods Park. That day was in the summer of 2015. My girlfriend and I decided to go camping there since the park offered great camping spots complete with tables and fire pits. Having spent my childhood exploring the trails and woods, I knew the park like the back of my hand. I especially loved a hidden path along the river, tucked between the water and the railroad tracks. It was secluded, scenic, and felt like something out of a storybook. I couldn't wait to show it to my girlfriend, thinking she'd love it as much as I did. After setting up camp, we crossed the tracks and began our hike. About 15 minutes in, my girlfriend was mesmerized by the river, snapping pictures of the view on her phone. Then, out of nowhere, we heard voices coming from the other side of the water. The river wasn't particularly wide, but the summer foliage made it impossible to see who was there. Suddenly, a man burst through the bushes and splashed into the river. He looked terrified, and as he ran, he tripped on a rock, falling hard into the water. I was about to head down the bank to check if he was okay, but before I could move, he got up, turned around and shouted, "No, please, don't." Then came the gunshots. 3 loud bangs echoed through the air. The man collapsed into the river again, this time motionless. It all happened so fast. One moment, there was shouting. The next, the man was lying lifeless in the water. My girlfriend and I didn't wait to process what had happened. The instant we heard the shots, we bolted. It was a complete shift in mood. Just minutes earlier, I'd been happy, excited even, to share one of my favorite places with her. Now we were sprinting for our lives. Though I knew the shots weren't aimed at us, I couldn't shake the fear that whoever fired the gun wouldn't want witnesses. As we ran, I couldn't help but slow my pace slightly, keeping my body between her and the direction of the shots. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was pure instinct. If someone was going to get hurt, I wanted it to be me, not her. That thought chilled me as much as the situation itself. I prayed that we wouldn't be followed and that, if I did get hit, it wouldn't harm her too. My girlfriend was incredible. She ran like her life depended on it, staying quiet and focused, and didn't stop until we were back across the tracks. Those moments were the most terrifying of my life. If I had been alone, or even with a male friend, it would have been frightening, but having her with me made it much worse. There was this primal urge to protect her, even though I knew I couldn't stop a bullet. All I could do was shield her as best I could. Thankfully, we made it out unscathed and called the police as soon as we were safe. To this day, I don't know who the man was or if the shooter was ever caught. What I do know is that I've never returned to Evergreen Woods Park, and I doubt I ever will. The scariest thing I've ever experienced happened during a solo camping trip in late July of 2013. For anyone unfamiliar with the weather in eastern Kentucky or not living there at the time, the area occasionally experiences intense summer storms called derechos. I'm not great at describing weather phenomena, so here's a definition from NOAA. A derecho is an extended, fast-moving windstorm linked to a band of severe thunderstorms. While a derecho can cause damage similar to a tornado, the destruction is typically concentrated in one direction, forming a straight path. For it to qualify as a derecho, the wind gusts must be at least 60 miles per hour over most of its area. To put it into perspective, a weak hurricane starts at around 74 miles per hour. So, a derecho is like a mini hurricane, not exactly catastrophic, but enough to cause serious problems. Now, imagine being alone, camping in the middle of the woods, seeing the sky turn dark, and realizing the wind is strong enough to bring down old or weakened trees. That's when I started to panic. Luckily, while I was searching for a spot to wait out the storm, I stumbled upon a man-made structure, a basic concrete shelter with a single wall. It didn't do much to shield me from the wind or rain, but if a tree fell nearby, it might save my life. Unfortunately for me, I wasn't the only creature in the forest with that idea. About an hour before sundown, while the wind was howling, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps thudding toward the shelter. Between the storm's roar and the shelter's position, I didn't hear it until it was practically on top of me. Then, before I could even react, a black bear came charging around the corner. The storm had clearly terrified it, which was very bad news for me. My immediate reaction was to shout and wave my arms wildly, trying to appear bigger and scarier than the storm. It startled the bear enough that it hesitated, jumped back, and ran past the shelter. But instead of continuing on its way, it circled back, running behind the shelter and coming around again. It was a terrifying loop. Every time it returned, I'd yell and flail, and the bear would retreat, only to come back again, each time closer. I realized it wanted the shelter but was deciding whether fighting me for it was worth the risk. After a few more passes, it was so close I could hear its claws scraping against the concrete floor and its loud, heavy breathing. I kept backing away to maintain some distance, but eventually, I ran out of room. The bear darted in and swiped at me, forcing me to retreat even further. Desperate, I grabbed my backpack and held it like a shield. It was heavy with my gear, so I planned to use it as a battering ram if the bear lunged at me again. My heart raced as the bear came around for what I feared would be the final charge. But when it saw me holding the pack, its appearance must have startled it. The way it changed my size or shape must have thrown it off. It let out a low roar, spun around in a confused circle, and bolted back into the woods. I was shaken but knew staying in the shelter wasn't much safer than leaving. The bear might return, but wandering through the stormy forest meant risking falling trees. Without shelter, even a minor injury could leave me vulnerable to the bear or the storm. I decided to stay put, gripping my backpack and praying the bear wouldn't return. That night was one of the most terrifying of my life. The storm howled relentlessly, and every cracking branch made me flinch, wondering if it was the bear or a falling tree. Somehow, I made it through unscathed, though I wouldn't exactly call it safe. A few years ago, I planned a camping trip with about 10 friends at a remote hot springs in the eastern part of a nearby state. It happened to be a Friday the 13th, and coincidentally, a full moon lit up the sky that night. The drive took roughly an hour, and since I had work the next day, I decided to limit my drinking to avoid a hangover. When we arrived, we picked a nice spot to camp, a little away from other groups. Once we settled in, we cracked open some drinks, relaxed, and later took a dip in the warm springs nearby. As the sun set, we decided to take a nighttime walk to enjoy the moonlit scenery and stars. By then, it was pitch dark, and only a handful of us were up for the walk. A side note, The three of us who went had been microdosing on mushrooms earlier, so everything had a slightly surreal edge, though I kept my senses sharp. It was me, two friends, and one of their dogs. We walked uphill for about 10 minutes using flashlights to guide us and turned onto a smaller trail after a bit. Barely 3 minutes later, we heard loud rustling in the bushes ahead, way too close for comfort. We froze, and my friend leading the group swept his flashlight around. If you've ever seen a big cat's glowing eyes in the dark, you know how terrifying it is, especially when the cat is huge. My heart raced as I realized we were face to face with a mountain lion just a short distance ahead. Instinct kicked in, and we slowly started backing away. However, the dog with us had a different instinct and bolted into the woods to the side. To our relief, the big cat didn't chase her. It kept its glowing eyes locked on us instead. As we kept retreating, we suddenly realized the dog had returned to our side. But then, what had we heard moving through the bushes behind us? We shined our flashlight again and, to our horror, spotted a second mountain lion. This one smaller, likely the first one's cub. Trapped between the two, we had no choice but to climb over the fence into someone else's campsite nearby. We got the dog over first and then scrambled over, tearing up our clothes and leaving my friend with a nasty cut on his leg. Now we were in an unfamiliar campsite, still shaken, under the eerie glow of a full moon on Friday the 13th, with the remnants of our mushroom trip amplifying the surrealness. We saw no sign of the campsite's owners and, in a panic, jumped into their unlocked car. We honked the horn repeatedly to scare off the mountain lions and shouted loudly to make it clear we weren't robbers. No one came to check on us, which felt unnerving. One of my friends claimed she heard faint screams or someone trying to cry out, but her boyfriend brushed it off, saying we needed to leave. Part of me believed her, though I didn't hear anything myself. Either way, I was desperate to get back to our own campsite. On the way back, I mentally prepared myself for the worst and even whispered a few prayers, despite not being religious. Once we returned, I was a complete wreck, convinced every sound around us was the mountain lions stalking us. I had a full-blown panic attack inside the car, while everyone else seemed to move on and enjoy themselves by the fire, even those who had shared the terrifying encounter. By morning, I was a hungover mess and skipped work that day, which led to me getting fired. Honestly, I didn't care. I was just grateful to have made it out alive. A couple of years ago, my partner and I went on a camping trip during the summer in Oklahoma. The first few days were peaceful, but one late afternoon, while we were cooking dinner, we heard someone yelling for help. The voice sounded nearby, just a few campsites over, but out of sight. Without hesitation, we ran toward the sound and stumbled upon a scene straight out of a nightmare. A man was leaning against a picnic table, clutching his abdomen, with blood pouring from a deep cut. He explained that he had been carrying a knife while walking, tripped, and accidentally stabbed himself. The wound was severe, and blood was everywhere. My partner quickly tried to stop the bleeding by applying pressure while I pulled out my phone to call for help, only to discover I had no signal. The nearest hospital was about 20 miles away, so even with service, help would take a while. That's when my partner asked the man where his truck keys were. The injured man managed to tell us, and I rushed to grab them. Within minutes, we had him in the back of his truck and were speeding toward the closest hospital. For me, the situation was especially terrifying because I have a history of fainting at the sight of blood. Even a small cut has made me pass out in the past. Despite my fears, I had to drive while my partner stayed in the back, keeping pressure on the wound. There was no way I could be back there without losing consciousness, and if that happened, I might have fallen out of the truck bed. On the other hand, if I fainted behind the wheel, we'd all be in serious danger. My partner reassured me to focus on the road and pull over if I felt faint, but the adrenaline must have kept me going. We made it to the hospital in about 12 minutes. Later, My partner told me that we'd arrived just as the man began slurring his speech. A clear sign things were getting critical. Any longer, and he might not have stayed conscious, which could have been disastrous. I'll never forget when the hospital staff opened the truck to take him out. There was a puddle of blood underneath him, and my partner's pants were soaked through. Once the man was in the care of the hospital, we drove his truck back to our campsite, where we realized his dog was still waiting. We tried to salvage the rest of the evening, but it was hard to shake off the intensity of what had just happened. The next morning, the man's brother arrived to collect his belongings and thanked us for saving his sibling's life. He told us the injured man had survived and was going to recover. It was a deeply emotional moment. If you've ever had someone thank you for saving a loved one, you'll understand how humbling it feels. We helped the brother pack up his things and wished him well before he left. The experience was terrifying, but knowing we saved a life brought us a sense of fulfillment. It's a memory that strengthened the bond between me and my now husband, and one we'll never forget. I can't believe it's been more than a decade since this happened. Time really flies if you're not paying attention. This story is probably one of the strangest experiences of my life, and back then, it was terrifying. At the time, I had recently started seeing my girlfriend. Because of our busy schedules, we barely spent time together. I was in my early 20s when all this happened, and all I wanted was to be with her. But finding a moment alone with her seemed impossible. We both lived with our families, so privacy was non-existent. We hadn't been dating long, but I was already frustrated. Felt like she always had plans, and I was just an afterthought. One weekend, I told her how I felt, and she apologized, saying she already had a camping trip planned with her friends. She felt bad that we couldn't spend time together again. I was upset and on the verge of ending things before they got too serious. Later that day, she texted me, saying her friend offered to let me join if I wanted. I didn't like camping, but I didn't want to miss a chance to be with her. The campsite was only about 45 minutes from where I lived, so I packed a bag and headed over. The place was odd, more like a big, open field surrounded by trees, filled with other campers. It didn't feel like the real camping I imagined, but I shrugged it off and focused on meeting her friends. Her friends were great, fun, loud, and outgoing, unlike my girlfriend, who was quieter and more reserved. They had an awesome sense of humor, and I started to enjoy myself. While hanging out, I noticed several trails leading into the woods. When I explored a bit, I realized how large the area was, and it finally felt like the camping I'd pictured. That evening, we grilled food on a portable grill and played card games. When night fell, we drank beers discreetly, hiding them in special cups since alcohol wasn't technically allowed. Around 11 p.m., 2 people came over to our campsite. I guess they were park officials or something. They shone their flashlights aggressively and demanded to know why we were still awake. We were confused. One of my girlfriend's friends spoke up sarcastically, saying, "Why wouldn't we be awake? It's our vacation." One of the officials snapped, "There's a strict curfew here. Lights out by 10 p.m. We thought it was a joke and laughed, but the official didn't budge. When another friend complained about paying for the campsite, the woman got even angrier. She yelled, "If I catch you awake, you're out of here." Frustrated, we all retreated to our tents. Someone suggested we quietly play cards in one tent, but the official must have overheard. She barked, "Lights out means lights out. No cards, no talking. Go to bed." It was ridiculous. We felt like kids being scolded. But since we'd been drinking, no one wanted to risk being kicked out and having to drive. Eventually, everyone fell asleep, except my girlfriend and me. We were savoring our rare time together. That's when she suggested something bold, sneaking onto one of the trails for some real privacy. I agreed immediately, We quietly slipped out of the tent and headed onto a trail. It was dark and peaceful, and for a while it was just the two of us. But the quiet didn't last. Out of nowhere, a man's voice called out, "Hey!" We froze, unsure of what to do. The voice called again, "I know you're there. I just want to say hi." Confused and uneasy, I peeked around a tree. Standing on the trail was a strange man with a flashlight. He was short, wearing an oversized shirt, and looked off. He noticed me and grinned. "Hey, buddy, I've got something for you," he said. I didn't respond. Then he added something bizarre. "I've got all this cash, and my ex-wife's trying to take it. I want to give it away before she finds it. Come get it." He held out his hand, but there was nothing in it. He stood about 20 feet away, thankfully not too close. I looked at my girlfriend and mouthed, "Run." As soon as she took off, I followed. The man shouted, "No," and lunged in my direction, but I was already sprinting. We ran back to the campsite, hearts pounding. Once there, we waited an hour for the officials to patrol before telling them about the man. I lied, saying I'd seen him from the tent, and they believed me. They contacted the authorities, and that was the last we heard about him. The rest of the night, I couldn't stop watching the woods, expecting him to reappear. Thankfully, he didn't. To this day, I have no idea what he wanted. But his strange grin and the way he lunged at us still haunt me. Every time camping season rolls around, I remember that eerie encounter and feel grateful we escaped unharmed. I'm writing this just hours after what I can only describe as one of the most bizarre experiences of my entire life. I know that sounds a little over the top, but in the moment, it truly felt surreal. My family and I had just arrived at our campsite for the weekend, and I can't shake this uneasy feeling, constantly glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. Deep down, I think we're safe, but I'm still on edge. So bear with me as I recount this event. I'm putting it all down for the first time, and it's still fresh in my mind. Late last night, we left our home to kick off a long-awaited camping trip. It was something my wife and I had done many times before, but this was the first time we were bringing our two kids along. We'd waited until they were old enough to truly enjoy and remember the experience. With everything packed and ready, we hit the road for the 7-hour drive just after midnight. At first, the kids were wide awake, buzzing with excitement, and the car turned into an impromptu karaoke session. But not long after, the singing faded, and everyone except me dozed off. That was fine by me. It gave me a chance to catch up on an audiobook I'd been meaning to finish. By the time we were nearing the campsite, I realized the rest of the family had slept through most of the trip, waking only occasionally to groggily ask where we were. With just about 40 minutes left to go, disaster struck. The unmistakable thud of a flat tire jolted me out of my focus, and the car wobbled as I quickly steered it to the side of the road. It was a blow I hadn't anticipated, especially so close to our destination. Fortunately, I had a spare tire, so while it was frustrating, it wasn't a catastrophe. I carefully got out of the car, trying not to wake anyone as I started digging through the luggage in the trunk to get to the tools. As I worked on replacing the flat, I couldn't help but wonder what had caused it. The road seemed clear, and the tire failure felt suspiciously sudden. I brushed off the thought and focused on getting the spare installed. I was almost finished tightening the lug nuts when I heard someone lightly clear their throat. It startled me, and for a split second, I thought it might be my wife. But when I turned, I saw a short woman standing there, her hair in unkempt twists, and a vine tattoo winding up from the base of her neck. "Hi there," she said softly. "Need some help?" Her tone was friendly, almost too polite, but something about the situation felt off. I smiled awkwardly and replied, "Oh, thanks, but I think I've got it covered." She didn't move, just stood there. glancing repeatedly toward the darkness on the other side of the road. Every time I looked in that direction, I saw nothing, but her persistent glances made my stomach tighten. She continued to offer help, her voice unnervingly calm and sweet, but I kept refusing, trying to stay polite while speeding up my work. As I packed up my tools and prepared to leave, she suddenly said, "You really should let me help you." Her voice, now lower and harsher, sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, she took a step closer and hissed, "Let me help you." The shift in her demeanor was unnerving. Gone was the kind, soft-spoken stranger. In her place stood someone angry and menacing. I'd had enough. "Look, lady," I said firmly, my voice louder than intended. "You need to leave. My family's in the car, and I'm not in the mood for games. If you don't go, I'll call the police." My tone must have surprised her, but instead of leaving, she started laughing. A cold, unsettling sound. Ignoring her, I turned back to the car, opened the driver's side door, and dropped the keys in the cup holder, ready to start the engine as soon as I got in. When I turned to grab the wrench I'd left by the flat tire, I caught sight of her swinging something heavy at me, a lug wrench. She was uncoordinated, and I managed to block the blow with my arm. Without thinking, I kicked her in the leg, sending her stumbling to the ground. She groaned, then scrambled to her feet and bolted toward the side of the road she'd been eyeing earlier. I didn't wait to find out where she went. Heart pounding, I jumped into the car, started it, and sped off, glancing constantly in the rearview mirror. The remaining half hour of the drive felt endless, but thankfully, there were no more incidents. My wife woke as we reached the campsite, and when I told her what had happened, she was furious that I hadn't called the police immediately. She contacted them as soon as we arrived, providing every detail I could remember about the woman, her appearance, and the location of the encounter. Now that we're settled at the campsite, I can't shake the feeling that she might try to find us. She must have noticed the camping gear in our truck. Was she behind the flat tire? I don't know. I have no proof, but I can't stop wondering what her real intentions were. Did she want the truck, our belongings, or something worse? For now, I'll try to focus on enjoying the trip with my family. But if anything new happens or the police update us, I'll share it. Until then, I hope I never see that woman or her vine tattoo again. There's a reason I have to be convinced every time someone suggests a camping trip, whether it's friends or family. It's not that I dislike the outdoors or nature. I just prefer sleeping in a proper bed rather than on the ground in a tent. That year, my boyfriend managed to talk me into a camping trip, but he sweetened the deal by suggesting we stay in a cabin so I could sleep comfortably. I still voted for a beach vacation, but at least this plan included a bed. Our group consisted of my boyfriend, me, and 2 other couples. The 6 of us found a cozy cabin in a wooded area that was mostly isolated, with a scenic lake only about 100 yards away. To my surprise, I was actually getting excited about the trip, especially once we arrived. The first day was perfect. We spent the day exploring trails, swimming in the lake, and later grilling steaks for dinner. By the time night fell, I was feeling pretty content. We all went to bed around midnight, but I didn't sleep well. All night, I thought I heard noises outside. I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, we were in the woods, and strange sounds weren't exactly unusual. The next morning, while we were preparing for a hike, we suddenly heard a cheerful voice call out from behind us. "Good morning. How's everyone doing today?" My boyfriend, ever the social one, immediately started chatting with the man. He introduced himself as Dale and claimed to be familiar with all the local trails. His presence was a little odd but not alarming. Dale said he lived nearby, had heard us talking, and wanted to check if we were settling in. It seemed thoughtful at first, Dale was tall, probably over 6 feet, with a stocky build. He wore jeans, hiking boots, and carried a backpack, looking like your average outdoorsy local. After chatting briefly, he laughed in a jolly way and headed off down a trail. We joked about the encounter for a while during our hike. Later that afternoon, we went to the lake for some swimming and sunbathing. As we sat on the dock, soaking up the sun, we suddenly heard the same voice. "There you are." Startled, we turned to see Dale standing at the edge of the dock. When we asked what he was doing there, he shrugged and said he was just passing by and noticed us. My boyfriend took it in stride and chatted with him again, but I felt uneasy, as did my friend Kara's boyfriend. Dale's constant glances around while they talked didn't help matters. He eventually wandered off, mumbling to himself as he left. That evening, we gathered around the campfire to tell spooky stories, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My unease only deepened when Dale suddenly leaped out of the bushes, shouting, "Here I am!" before laughing loudly. We all jumped in fright, and my boyfriend, now visibly annoyed, told Dale off. He explained that sneaking up on us like that wasn't funny and warned him to leave us alone. Dale looked upset, muttering that he'd only wanted to make our trip more exciting, before disappearing down a trail. The mood was ruined, and we called it a night soon after. Inside the cabin, we cleaned up in preparation for leaving the next morning. Lying in bed, I confessed to my boyfriend that I had a bad feeling about Dale. I couldn't help but wonder if the noises I'd heard the previous night had been him. That night, I struggled to sleep again. At some point, I clearly heard footsteps and heavy breathing outside the window. Panicking, I woke my boyfriend, who reluctantly got up to check. His face went pale as he whispered that someone was outside, pacing back and forth, and it looked like Dale. I peeked cautiously. Dale was muttering to himself, pacing, and occasionally hitting his head with his hands. He tried the cabin door but found it locked, then became visibly upset, striking his head harder. After a few minutes, he disappeared into the woods. Terrified, we called the cabin owner and then the police. When an officer arrived, we recounted everything, including Dale's strange behavior. The officer seemed indifferent, as if he didn't grasp the seriousness of the situation. We stayed up until dawn, packed our things, and left as soon as the sun rose. Driving down the main road, we spotted Dale walking along the side, still mumbling and hitting his head occasionally. We reported his location to the police before continuing home. I don't know if they ever found him or what his intentions were, but I'm glad nothing worse happened. From now on, camping trips are off my list. About 5 years ago, my partner and I went on a trip to New Mexico. I'm not sure how she always does it, but she found this amazing campsite for us. Whenever I try to plan something, it's usually a disaster, which is one of the reasons I adore her. She always has a solid plan and helps me stay on track. I tend to be indecisive, so her practicality balances me out. This camping spot allowed us to set up wherever we wanted. I drove our SUV to what felt like the ideal location, and we started preparing everything: our tent, grill, some music, and other essentials to make this trip unforgettable. We had planned to stay 5 nights, but sadly, we only managed 3. If you had experienced what we did on the 3rd night, you'd probably have left early too. The first 2 days were wonderful. Unlike most camping locations in the US, this area was vastly different. Growing up on the East Coast, I associated camping with dense forests, serene lakes, and horror movie vibes. Here, though, it was all about rugged mountains, dry terrain, and a type of plant life I wasn't familiar with. I fell in love with the landscape instantly and made it a point to savor every moment. What made this trip even more special was how secluded it was. In 3 days, we didn't see another soul. While that might unsettle some people, it was perfect for us. Then came the 3rd night, the one we'll never forget. The day started off just as great as the others. We hiked some nearby trails, and by the evening we were more worn out than usual. We decided to call it an early night and climbed into the tent around 9 p.m. I remember checking my phone for the time before quickly drifting off to sleep, as did my wife. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to her shaking me. Concerned, I asked her what was wrong. She put her finger to her lips, signaling me to stay quiet, and pointed outside the tent. I tried to listen, but at first, I couldn't hear anything. Then, she whispered that she thought there was an animal nearby. I chuckled softly, thinking it was endearing that she was worried about an animal. Looking back, it was naive of me. Plenty of creatures in that region could harm us if they felt threatened. I began listening more closely and finally heard it. A low growl. It wasn't like any growl I'd ever heard before. It wasn't deep and menacing like a bear's. It sounded faint and strange, almost like something imitating a growl. For a moment, I wondered if it might be a sick animal. Then, I remembered an article about rabid coyotes attacking people, and my heart raced. The footsteps outside sounded light, suggesting it wasn't very large, but I didn't want to take any risks. When the sounds moved a bit farther from the tent, I quietly unzipped it and told my wife to head to the SUV. Once the zipper was open, we saw nothing, so we quickly made our way to the vehicle. I unlocked the doors, and we jumped in, locking them behind us. From inside, we scanned the area through the tinted windows, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had been outside. Minutes passed, and nothing appeared, no movement, no sounds. But we both knew something had been there. The growling and footsteps were too clear to dismiss. Just as my wife started to drift back to sleep, I jolted her awake with a scream. What I saw wasn't an animal, it was a person. A disheveled man with long, wild hair and a scruffy beard. He was hunched over, growling the same eerie sound we'd heard before. My initial reaction was anger. I was ready to confront him, but before I could act, the situation escalated. From the shadows near our campsite, 3 more figures appeared. They moved toward our tent, whispering and laughing quietly. 3 of them carried large sticks, or at least that's what they looked like. Without warning, one of the men raised his stick high above his head and smashed it down onto our empty tent. He shouted something, probably thinking we were still inside. Adrenaline kicked in and I started the engine. We sped off without looking back, leaving the tent and everything behind. My only focus was getting as far away as possible. Once we reached a spot with cell service, my wife called the authorities. She explained what had happened and was later contacted by someone in law enforcement, likely a ranger or park official. We never returned for our belongings, and the park charged us a fee for abandoning our gear and cutting our reservation short. While the officers were sympathetic, the campground's management showed no concern and stuck to their policies. In the end, it was a small price to pay for our safety. I hope those men were caught and prevented from terrorizing anyone else. A few years ago, when my wife was still my girlfriend, we decided to take an unplanned camping trip. I didn't have much camping experience aside from a couple of trips with a buddy, but my girlfriend used to camp often with her family when she was younger and was eager to relive the experience. She thought it would be a perfect way for us to spend time together away from the hustle and bustle of the city where we lived. She went all out and bought a bunch of new camping gear, including a spacious tent that seemed oversized for just the 2 of us. I didn't mind, it gave us extra room, which was welcome since I was a larger guy back then. One thing I appreciated about the tent, which I later learned is standard with most tents, was a small window that allowed us to peek outside. I liked the idea of being able to look out at night and have sunlight stream in to wake us in the morning. We arrived at a remote camping spot in the afternoon. Since we were only staying 2 nights, we wanted to make the most of the trip. That first afternoon was pretty low-key. We set up our tent, relaxed a bit, and went to bed early. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I admired the view through the tent's little window. The clear night sky was stunning, full of stars. The next morning, as expected, sunlight poured through the window, gently waking us. It felt oddly comforting, almost like waking up at home. We got up early, made breakfast, and spent the day hiking, fishing, and relaxing in the sunshine. It was a perfect mix of activity and calm, and we felt ready for another early night. That evening, we settled into the tent, cozy and tired from the day's adventures. I propped open the little window screen to enjoy the view. As I started drifting off, something outside caught my eye. Movement. Maybe? I couldn't tell if I had imagined it. But before I could focus, my girlfriend whispered, "Did you see that?" I told her I thought I had seen something, but I wasn't sure. We both sat up, peering out the window. At first, everything seemed normal, a peaceful, quiet night. Then my girlfriend suddenly gasped, and the sound chilled me. Her expression was one of pure fear, something I'd never seen on her before. About 30 or 40 feet away, perched on a tree branch, was a person. They wore a strange, fake mask, like the kind of mask meant to look like a famous face. The figure was casually swinging their legs, almost like a child playing on a swing. We froze. Until that moment, we hadn't seen a single person in the area, and now this masked figure was so close to us. My heart raced. I wanted to cry but held it in, trying to stay strong since my girlfriend was already in tears. The person wasn't doing anything directly to us, but their presence alone was deeply unsettling. We watched them for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably about 5 minutes. Then suddenly they jumped down from the tree. The figure didn't approach the tent, but they started pacing around slowly, as though deciding what to do next. The whole time, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, convinced they might charge toward us at any second. Then they stopped moving entirely, standing motionless like a statue. After a couple of minutes, the person turned to face the tent. Even with the mask on, it felt as though they were staring directly at us. Then we heard muffled laughter from under the mask. The person raised a hand and began waving, an exaggerated, frantic motion as if they were trying to shake their arm loose. Just as abruptly, the waving stopped. In a muffled voice, they called out, "Bye, guys," before sprinting at full speed into the woods, disappearing from view. We sat there, wide-eyed, unable to process what had just happened. We stayed awake most of the night, occasionally dozing off but mostly staring out of the tent's little window, listening for any sounds. The masked person never returned, and by morning, there was no sign they had ever been there. No footprints, no trail, nothing. The scariest part was realizing that whoever it was had been watching us for an unknown amount of time. They could have been in that tree for minutes or hours before we noticed. Though we were physically unharmed, the experience left us shaken for a long time. We've gone camping a few times since, but now we stick to cabins with secure doors. That unsettling encounter is something neither of us will ever forget. Many people dislike city life, but I'll take the hustle and bustle over the wilderness any day, especially after what happened to me and my friends about a year ago. One of my friends had recently ended her long-term relationship of 6 years, and she wasn't handling the breakup well, which I completely understood. Another friend of ours, who loves the outdoors, suggested we take a break and spend a night camping in the woods. To our surprise, our newly single friend agreed. We rented a cozy little cabin deep in the forest for a night. I was actually excited to have a girls' getaway that didn't involve the city's nightlife or dressing up. But, as I predicted, our heartbroken friend got bored shortly after we arrived. She started looking up nearby spots and found a small bar in a nearby village. She convinced us to go, and honestly, I joked that this was more my style of camping. The bar had a simple charm with only a handful of locals. While we were there, our recently single friend struck up a conversation with a man sitting alone. He was older than us but had a rugged kind of attractiveness. Whether it was the drinks or her emotions, she ended up flirting with him quite a bit. After a while, she left his company and told us she was ready to head back to the cabin. On our way back, we teased her about her bar friend, and she just laughed it off, insisting it wasn't serious. Back at the cabin, we poured some wine, but it was clear we weren't cut out for rustic living. The lack of internet and entertainment made it painfully boring. Though the effort to cheer her up was sweet, this plan wasn't working for any of us. We decided to sleep in the living room together, one on the couch, one on a love seat, and one in a recliner. It didn't take long for us to fall asleep. Sometime after 3 a.m., I was woken by one of my friends nudging me. She looked frightened and whispered that she'd heard the doorknob rattling. I thought she was imagining things, but then I heard it too. Someone was outside, aggressively trying to open the door. Terrified, we huddled together on the couch, listening. The cabin was small, and we could hear whoever it was moving around outside, their footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. They walked around the entire cabin, and soon we heard them behind us near a large window. The faint sound of someone fiddling with the window latch sent chills through us. Summoning courage I didn't know I had, I shouted, "I'm calling the police!" The noise stopped, and then, to our horror, a man's voice softly called out our friend's name. It was the same name she had told the man at the bar. I yanked open the curtain, and there he was, the man she'd spoken to earlier. He froze like a deer in headlights, his hands raised as if to say he meant no harm. Then, without a word, he bolted into the darkness. We immediately called the police and reported what happened. Though the officers came and checked the area, they didn't find anything. We packed up and left as soon as they were gone. On the drive home, we started piecing things together. We'd returned to the cabin well before midnight, and this man didn't try breaking in until hours later. That meant he must have followed us, waited for us to fall asleep, and then tried to get in. The realization that he had been lurking outside all that time made us sick. We later found out that the window he was trying to open had been unlocked. If my friend hadn't woken up when she did, who knows what might have happened. Oddly enough, the ordeal gave our friend a new perspective. She was so grateful we escaped unharmed that it helped her start moving forward after her breakup. "15 years ago, back when I was around 12, my parents let me invite 2 of my best friends over for a backyard campout. They set up a tent, and my mom stocked up on snacks while my dad ordered pizza and drinks before heading out for a dinner date. We were thrilled about our little camping adventure and brought as much food as possible into the backyard. We spent the evening chatting and munching, planning scary stories and roasting marshmallows later in the night. After eating our fill, we started gossiping about our school crushes and whether we'd work up the courage to ask them to dance at the next school event. Inside the tent, we tried to build a cozy fort with blankets and pillows, but nothing stayed up the way we wanted. The whole time, I kept thinking I heard noises outside. I unzipped the tent's window to check but saw nothing. A few minutes later, one of my friends mentioned hearing something brushing against the tent. Audrey peered through the open window and asked, "Do you see that black shape over there?" I squinted and suddenly noticed a small white mark, almost like a Nike logo, darting in the shadows. That's when I screamed, and the others joined in. We bolted into the house and locked ourselves in the bathroom. Huddled together, we tried to stay quiet, but then we heard footsteps. The doorknob jiggled, and we shrieked. Audrey grabbed her phone and called the police, but just as she started explaining, my mom's voice called out for us to come out. When we opened the door, my parents were there, and my dad sheepishly admitted it was just him playing a prank. "Sorry, girls," he said. Taking the phone to assure the dispatcher it was a misunderstanding. Being from a small town where my dad knew everyone, the police never showed up. Though we were furious at first, we couldn't stay mad for long. My dad, ever the jokester, made it up to us by helping with esmores and even offering to get anything we needed. Later, as we settled back into the tent, we chatted until one by one, we fell asleep. I stayed awake the longest, making sure my friends were comfortable. But I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night to the sound of heavy breathing. At first, I assumed it was one of my friends snoring, but the sound grew louder. When I sat up, I found myself eye level with the tent window. A flash of movement sent chills down my spine, and then I heard the tent zipper being pulled. Thinking it was my dad again, I groaned, "Dad, cut it out. You already scared us once." But the voice that answered wasn't his. It was deeper, almost a growl. "How do you know it's me?" Frozen with fear, I grabbed my friends and dragged them out of the tent. We ran straight into the house and woke my parents. My dad immediately went outside, shouting at whoever it was, then came back in and called the police. He waited outside until the officers arrived. When he returned, he explained that a man had been causing trouble in the area, but thankfully, they caught him. My dad apologized profusely for scaring us earlier and asked if my friends wanted to call their parents. Audrey stayed, but our other friend decided to head home. Audrey and I moved our campout into the living room. My dad built us a blanket fort, and we stayed up for a little while before finally falling asleep. The next morning, my parents made us a big breakfast, and we spent the day by the pool, which was just what we needed to shake off the previous night's fright. Audrey and I are still close friends today, but we've never gone camping again since that night. Born on May 15, 1949, Harold Monroe was the only son of a World War II veteran living in Modesto, California. Harold's father, reflecting his wartime experiences, was the embodiment of a disciplined military man who ran his household with strict precision. He frequently recounted his time in the war, often telling Harold and the family about his battles against the Axis forces, emphasizing the sacrifices he made for their freedom. This upbringing instilled in Harold a worldview centered on loyalty, discipline, and martial values. Surprisingly, Harold grew up to be a well-adjusted teenager. Though his father was strict, he was neither abusive nor unkind. Harold developed strong social skills and was even voted most likely to succeed by his classmates at Patterson Valley High School. However, tragedy struck in 1967, just after Harold graduated. One of his closest friends, Brian, was killed in a car accident when a reckless drunk driver sped around a blind curve on a California highway and collided with him. The sudden loss devastated Harold. Within weeks of Brian's death, Harold constructed a shrine in his bedroom, including candles, a photo, and some of Brian's belongings. When Harold's girlfriend saw this, she was deeply unsettled. Mourning a loved one was understandable, but Harold's fixation seemed obsessive. Her concerns deepened when Harold confided that he feared he might be in love with Brian, suggesting the pain of loss was amplified by unspoken feelings. Whether this was true or not remains uncertain. Harold's depression drove a wedge between him and his girlfriend, and he turned to marijuana and LSD to cope. His experimentation with hallucinogens created further distance between the two, and they eventually broke up. By 1971, at just 22, Harold followed his family's advice and voluntarily admitted himself to a mental health facility to address his spiraling depression. However, his stays were short-lived. He moved between institutions without significant improvement and eventually abandoned professional help altogether. Without treatment, Harold's behavior worsened, and signs of paranoid schizophrenia began to surface. After being evicted from his Salinas apartment for disruptive behavior, including pounding on the floors and yelling at non-existent people, Harold found himself homeless. He attempted to join a seminary, but his erratic demeanor led church leaders to turn him away. In 1974, Harold, now 25, was arrested for vagrancy after an officer found him burning himself with a cigarette. Recognizing his inability to care for himself, Harold's parents took him back into their Stockton home, leading to a brief improvement in his condition. However, during this time, Harold developed a deranged worldview rooted in a dark obsession. Harold was born on May 15th, the same day as the infamous San Francisco earthquake of 1906. This event, with its 7.9 magnitude tremors, caused widespread devastation and thousands of deaths. Harold had read extensively about the disaster during his childhood, and it profoundly shaped his thinking. He became convinced that catastrophic earthquakes were the result of an ancient subterranean force demanding human sacrifices. He further believed that American wars somehow appeased this entity, preventing large-scale quakes. To support this belief, Harold meticulously charted earthquakes alongside major U.S. conflicts. He noted a lull in earthquakes during World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. In contrast, he pointed to the 1933 Long Beach earthquake, which occurred shortly after the U.S. withdrew from Nicaragua, as evidence of the connection. For Harold, these patterns confirmed his twisted theory. Without bloodshed, the ancient force would wreak havoc. Driven by this belief, Harold set out on a deadly mission. His initial plan was to join the U.S. Marine Corps to emulate his father's service and facilitate necessary sacrifices. Although he excelled in physical and mental tests, his admission was denied after he admitted to past drug use. This rejection deepened Harold's paranoia, and he became convinced of a conspiracy against him. In January 1975, Harold sought out an old friend, George Tanner, who he believed had sabotaged his life by introducing him to drugs. When Harold discovered George had moved, he went to the new occupants, a woman named Lisa Franklin and her 2 young children. After Lisa provided George's new address, Harold killed her and her sons, erasing potential witnesses. Harold then tracked down George and his wife, murdering them in their Santa Clara home. These murders were part of a broader spree. Harold killed several others, including a hitchhiker, a college student, and even a retired fisherman. He justified these acts as sacrifices to prevent earthquakes. His most notorious crime occurred in February 1975, when he killed a group of teenagers camping in Redwood State Park after accusing them of damaging the environment. Harold's killing spree ended when witnesses to one of his daylight murders reported his license plate to police. He was arrested without resistance and confessed, claiming his actions were necessary to prevent a catastrophic earthquake. During his trial, Harold was charged with multiple murders. Although his defense highlighted his schizophrenia, the jury found him guilty of several counts of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and remains incarcerated. Just days after Harold's arrest, a significant earthquake struck Southern California, causing widespread damage. For Harold, this event vindicated his delusions. Though widely regarded as a paranoid and violent individual, Harold's crimes continue to provoke unsettling questions about the coincidences he pointed to. I didn't grow up with much of a family. My mother passed away after being disowned by her parents, and my father spent most of his life shuffling in and out of mental health institutions before taking his own life. The only relative I knew of was my dad's brother, my uncle. One of the few dark truths I was aware of about my family was that my uncle carried guilt over my father's death. He'd cut himself off from the world, living alone in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I had only a vague idea of where the place was and absolutely no interest in finding it. To me, he was as good as dead, like my parents. Honestly, I blamed him for my father's death, too. Focusing my anger on him gave me some sense of closure after a childhood filled with pain and loss. Against all odds, by the summer of 2017, I had built a decent life for myself near Burlington. I worked as an assistant manager at a local brewery, had a cozy apartment, and even managed to go on a few dates. I was moving on from my past, and it felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. Then came the letter that changed everything. It was from a law office in Montpelier, Vermont. As soon as I saw the state postmark, I had a sinking feeling. The letter informed me that my uncle had passed away. The lawyer was handling his estate, dividing what little there was among surviving relatives. I'd always assumed my uncle didn't have much, and the letter confirmed that. Still, he had left something for me in his will. Annoyingly, I would have to travel to Montpelier to find out what it was. Curious but unwilling to drive, I called the lawyer and asked directly what I'd inherited. He explained that he didn't know. All he had was a key to a safety deposit box at a local bank, along with instructions to ensure I opened it and understood what was inside. His payment, it seemed, was also locked in the box. The situation felt like the premise of a bad thriller movie. But when the lawyer assured me this was serious, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to make the trip. If there was something valuable, I wasn't going to leave it behind. On a warm Friday in mid-July, I took half a day off and made the drive to Montpelier. The Vermont countryside was beautiful in summer, but my anxiety about what awaited me gnawed at my nerves the entire way. At the lawyer's office, I met the man handling my uncle's affairs. We drove together to the local bank where the deposit box was held. My hands were clammy as we entered the vault. When I opened the box, I found only 2 items: a small stack of cash and a letter. The lawyer took the money, leaving the letter for me. But as I held it, I couldn't bring myself to read it. When the lawyer noticed my hesitation, I asked him to summarize it instead. He agreed. I watched as he opened the envelope and read its contents. His puzzled expression unnerved me. Finally, he handed me the letter. It wasn't an explanation, apology, or farewell. It contained only a set of coordinates and 3 cryptic words: "Burn it all." The lawyer asked me if the coordinates meant anything. I didn't know for sure, but a quick search on my phone revealed they pointed to a remote area near the Green Mountains. I guessed it was where my uncle's cabin was located, but what he wanted me to destroy, I had no idea. As unsettling as the situation was, my curiosity was hooked. What had my uncle been hiding? Was it illegal? Immoral? Whatever it was, I felt compelled to find out. The next morning, armed with a gas can and matches, I set out for the cabin. The closer I got, the more unnerving the forest became. Strange fungi dotted the landscape, grotesque, brain-like growths and red, bleeding mushrooms clung to the trees. The deeper I went, the more these bizarre fungi multiplied, creating an almost alien landscape. The smell of the cabin reached me before I saw it. A rancid, meaty odor mixed with rot. When I finally laid eyes on the structure, it was a decaying wreck, covered in the same weird fungi as the forest. Overwhelmed by the stench, I hesitated at the door, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside. The interior was worse than I imagined. The air was thick and humid like a sauna. Fungi grew everywhere. A large pot on the stove was filled with something foul, and tubes connected to it pumped vapor throughout the cabin. Books, covered in mold, were strewn across the floor. Strange symbols were scrawled on a chalkboard. The whole place felt like a cross between a scientist's lab and a nightmare. I could barely stand the smell and retreated outside, gagging. Determined to carry out my uncle's final request, I doused the cabin in gasoline and set it ablaze. As the flames consumed it, I swear I heard something, like a low, guttural scream. I drove home in silence, haunted by the experience. I'll never know what my uncle was doing in that cabin or why he wanted it destroyed. Maybe some secrets are better left buried. I've tried to move on. I have a stable life now and someone I love. But every now and then, I think about those mushrooms and that cabin in the woods. If you ever find yourself near the Green Mountains and start seeing those strange fungi, do yourself a favor, turn back. Born on May 20th, 1948, Harold Milton grew up as the only child of a World War II veteran in Modesto, California. Harold's father, embodying the archetype of a disciplined war hero, ran the household with military precision. He often shared stories of his service, emphasizing the sacrifices he made during the war, which he believed shielded his family from hardship. These tales profoundly shaped Harold's worldview, instilling in him values of loyalty, discipline, and a fascination with combat. Surprisingly, Harold developed into a sociable and successful young man. Though his father was strict, he was neither cruel nor harsh and ensured Harold learned the social skills that earned him the title of most likely to succeed at Central Valley High School. But in 1966, tragedy struck. One of Harold's closest friends, David, died in a car accident when a drunk driver sped around a blind curve on a rural Californian road. Devastated, Harold sank into a profound depression. Within weeks of David's passing, Harold created a shrine in his room. It featured candles, a photo of David from the yearbook, and personal mementos. When Harold's girlfriend saw this, she was disturbed. Mourning a friend was natural, but Harold's obsession seemed unsettling. Her fears deepened when Harold confided that he worried he might have been in love with David, which made the loss unbearably painful. This revelation strained their relationship. To cope, Harold turned to drugs, experimenting with marijuana and LSD in hopes of finding relief. These habits only widened the rift with his girlfriend, and they soon broke up. By 1970, at 22 years old, Harold checked himself into a psychiatric hospital at his family's urging. Though his stay was voluntary, Harold moved between facilities without much improvement, ultimately abandoning treatment. By 1971, Harold's behavior had deteriorated. He exhibited signs of paranoid schizophrenia, which alienated him from others. After a series of outbursts in his Salinas apartment, including yelling at imaginary people, he was evicted. Homeless, Harold attempted to join a religious seminary but was turned away due to his erratic behavior. Harold became increasingly obsessed with the idea of sacrifice and natural disasters. He fixated on the coincidence of his birthday, May 20th, with a major historical event, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. This earthquake, with a magnitude of 7.9, caused devastating destruction, fires, and over 3,000 deaths. Harold believed that the quake was the work of an ancient subterranean entity demanding human sacrifices to prevent such disasters. Harold compiled a timeline of earthquakes and correlated them with U.S. wars, convinced that times of war reduced earthquake fatalities. This belief solidified his delusion that sacrifices, whether on battlefields or through his own actions, were necessary to appease this entity. In 1972, Harold, now 24, applied to join the Marines, intending to fulfill this imagined duty. Though he excelled in the tests, his admission was denied due to his drug use, further fueling his paranoia. His delusions escalated. Harold began targeting those he believed were aligned with the malevolent force he feared. In a series of killings in 1972 and early 1973, he murdered multiple individuals, including a former high school acquaintance, Jim Larson, and Jim's family. Harold justified these killings as necessary sacrifices. He committed more heinous acts, murdering strangers and mutilating their bodies. In one instance, he attacked a hitchhiker, claiming the man symbolized a biblical figure requiring sacrifice. Another victim, a college student, was stabbed and dismembered. Harold's most shocking act was the murder of a priest, whom he believed volunteered as a sacrifice. Despite his crimes, Harold occasionally displayed remorse. Witnesses reported seeing him at a church shortly before murdering the priest, suggesting an internal conflict. However, his actions showed premeditation and calculation. Harold's killing spree ended when police arrested him in early 1973 after a witness provided his license plate. In custody, Harold confessed, claiming his murders were to prevent earthquakes. Chillingly, California experienced no significant earthquakes during his killing spree. At his trial, the jury debated Harold's sanity. While his schizophrenia was undeniable, his ability to plan some of his murders suggested lucidity. He was convicted of multiple murders, receiving a life sentence. Despite several parole hearings, Harold remains imprisoned, his mental instability making his release unlikely. Eerily, shortly after Harold's arrest, California experienced a 5.8 magnitude earthquake, causing significant damage. This coincidence led some to wonder if Harold's delusions contained a kernel of truth. Though Harold's beliefs were rooted in madness, his story continues to provoke unsettling questions about coincidence, causality, and the mysteries of the earth. In the summer of 1976, the affluent Anderson family from the suburban town of Maplewood, near Detroit, spent their vacation at their lakefront cabin along Lake Superior, a short drive north of Pinehurst near the Straits of Mackinac. The couple, Tom and Margaret Anderson, had been married for nearly 2 decades and had built a comfortable life through their success in marketing and publishing. They raised 4 children together: 18-year-old Brian, 15-year-old Greg, 11-year-old Ryan, and 6-year-old Emma. To outsiders, the Andersons appeared to be the picture of a thriving, happy family, but behind closed doors lay a web of hidden troubles, some darker than others. Tom's publishing business, which had flourished in its early years, was now facing financial challenges. Unpaid bills were piling up, bank accounts showed erratic withdrawals, and investors were growing increasingly skeptical about Tom's ability to deliver returns. Compounding the strain, his office had seen a high turnover of assistants, with many leaving within months. Rumors swirled that Tom's inappropriate behavior made the workplace unbearable. Allegations included requests for female employees to lift their skirts under the guise of inspection, though his wife Margaret remained oblivious to these accusations. The Anderson family's vacation home, called Evergreen Lodge, was a picturesque log and stone cottage set off a winding road, a short distance from the shoreline. When they arrived in June, Margaret couldn't have imagined the horrific events that awaited them. About a month into their stay, the property's caretakers started receiving complaints from neighbors about a foul odor emanating from the cabin. Concerned, the caretaker went to investigate. The house was locked tight, and he initially assumed it was something as simple as spoiled food or a plumbing issue. But upon forcing his way inside, he was met with a nightmare that would scar him for life. The stench of decay overwhelmed him as he stepped into the sweltering house, where the heat was inexplicably cranked up despite the blazing July temperatures. In the living room, Margaret Anderson's decomposed body lay face down, partially covered with a plaid blanket, a gunshot wound to the head marking her death. Tom's body was found near a vent, having been shot with 2 different firearms, a small caliber pistol and a rifle, and his skull bore signs of blunt force trauma. The grisly scene left no doubt of the violence they had endured. The caretaker stumbled out, vomiting from the horror, and quickly alerted law enforcement. Police discovered young Ryan sprawled atop his father, killed by a single gunshot wound. Nearby lay Emma, her small body riddled with bullet wounds and a fractured skull. Upstairs, the 2 older Anderson children were found in a bedroom, both shot in the head. Brian also had a bullet wound in his back, suggesting he had tried to flee. Investigators pieced together a chilling sequence. The killer had likely fired through a window to incapacitate Tom before breaking into the house and hunting down the rest of the family. The intruder had been methodical, even attempting to conceal the scene by covering a broken window with cardboard and drawing the curtains. The oppressive heat, deliberately left on, accelerated decomposition, complicating the determination of the time of death. Despite the calculated nature of the crime, only a single set of footprints was discovered, pointing to a lone perpetrator. Neighbors recalled hearing gunshots in late June but dismissed them as hunters. The last people to see the Andersons alive were a tree service crew hired by Tom to trim branches around the property. Investigators initially focused on Tom's business dealings, suspecting an aggrieved associate. This led them to Frank Delgado, a 31-year-old former soldier who had worked closely with Tom for years. Delgado's financial records revealed he had been embezzling funds from the company, and further inquiry showed he had recently purchased firearms matching the calibers used in the murders. Delgado claimed to have given away one of the rifles, but a neighbor reported seeing it in his possession not long before the killings. Police searches uncovered shell casings at a firing range linked to Delgado's family, strengthening suspicions. Though Delgado failed 2 polygraph tests and acted suspiciously, prosecutors initially declined to charge him due to insufficient physical evidence, including the absence of the murder weapons. In 1973, as a renewed effort to prosecute Delgado gained traction, he took his own life, leaving behind a typed note in which he admitted to being dishonest in business dealings but vehemently denied involvement in the Anderson murders. The note read, "I am a fraud but not a killer. Forgive me." His death effectively ended active investigations, and the case was left unsolved. The brutal slaying of the Anderson family remains one of Michigan's most haunting mysteries. Though theories have abounded, no definitive answers have emerged. Friends and colleagues of Tom Anderson describe him as a devoted family man, unable to comprehend why anyone would want to destroy his family. To this day, the identity of the killer remains unknown, and the tragedy stands as a grim reminder of the darkness that sometimes lurks behind even the most idyllic facades. My name is Jack, and I'm a member of a walking group called the Trail Walkers Society. We're a community dedicated to enjoying the pleasures of hiking and exploring nature, as well as working to protect the outdoor spaces people cherish. I know it might sound dull, and I'll admit that a lot of our members are retirees with thick jackets or enthusiasts who dream of being survival experts. But long walks aren't the reason I joined the society. When you learn about our history, you realize that we've actually been involved in some pretty intense moments. To keep it brief, the walking movement started in the late 1800s. At that time, wealthy landowners wanted to close off huge parts of the countryside and turn it into private land. This sparked outrage and led to protests in the form of mass trespassing. There were conflicts, arrests, and injuries. It was a big deal, eventually leading to the passing of a law that ensured public rights to access certain lands. So when you go out for a walk, you're not just taking a leisurely stroll, you're exercising the right to enjoy beautiful natural places. And to me, that's a meaningful part of what we do. I usually tell people this when I want to spark their interest in the group. We're all about spreading the message. But there are things I leave out when talking about rambling, because if I were to mention them, it might actually scare some people away from exploring nature altogether. If you go walking in forests, hills, or woodlands regularly, you're bound to have a few strange experiences, maybe even some that make your hair stand on end. Since I've already bored you with the group's background, I'll share a creepy experience I had while rambling near a town called Hereford in the UK. I was walking through a dense forest near an area known as the Black Wood. I came across a small clearing that didn't seem like much at first. I wasn't planning to walk into it. It was drizzling, and the trees were offering shelter. But something caught my attention when I noticed what looked like a floating ball of grass. It reminded me of one of those strange visual effects you might see in an old film. I just stood there staring at it for a moment as it gently swayed in the breeze. When I got closer, I realized it wasn't floating. It was actually hanging from a branch of a tall oak tree. Someone had crafted a ball out of grass and tied it to the branch with twine. Being the curious person I am, I walked over to investigate. As I approached, I saw it wasn't exactly what I'd first thought. From a distance, it looked like some tangled grass, but up close, it appeared to be solid turf. It was like someone had cut a patch of grass from a lawn, rolled it up into a ball, and somehow tied it to the tree. There were no visible seams. It looked almost like a miniature planet hanging there, perfectly crafted. I couldn't help but be amazed by the skill it must have taken to create it. Whoever made it had clearly put a lot of effort into it. I gently pushed the ball and watched it sway, the raindrops mixing with the creaking of the tree. That's when I noticed what was below it. Directly beneath the turf ball was an old tree stump. This wasn't just any stump, though. It looked like it had been worn down, smoothed out over time, and hollowed out. Inside, the hollowed space was filled with twigs, reeds, and wildflowers, arranged in a pattern that resembled the layers of a blooming flower. There were hundreds of tiny twigs, some bent into intricate shapes, creating a three-dimensional effect. I couldn't help but think it must have taken days to assemble. I didn't see any signs of missing grass around the clearing, so it seemed like someone had brought the turf ball from elsewhere. They might have even brought a ladder, because climbing a 20-foot oak tree isn't something just anyone would do. I thought maybe it was the work of an eccentric artist or some kind of guerrilla art installation. As I knelt to examine the tree stump, I noticed that not all the pieces were twigs. I picked up something that looked like an old bone and quickly realized that's exactly what it was. At first, I thought it was an animal bone, but then a thought crossed my mind. That bone could have come from a human finger or toe. It was a chilling thought, and I quickly dropped the bone. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to put it back exactly where I had found it. I was about to reach for my phone to take a picture when I swear I heard movement behind me, in the tree line. I spun around, hoping to see the person who had created the strange installation. But no one was there. It could have been an animal, but I didn't hear any more noise, just total silence. That's when the horrible feeling hit me. I felt like someone, or something, was watching me. Nervously, I called out a greeting, hoping it was the creator of the display. But again, silence. It wasn't just my imagination. I was certain something was there, but no one answered. I put my phone away, not daring to take any pictures. I had this deep, primal fear that if I turned my back, whatever was out there might take the chance to approach. If they'd been willing to use bones for their art, who knew what they would do to protect it? My nerves were getting the better of me. Eventually, I backed away from the clearing, walking faster and faster, my head turning constantly until I felt I was at a safe distance. But what was I safe from? The fear didn't go away, and as I walked, I couldn't help but question what I had just witnessed. I wanted to return and document it, but the fear of going back was stronger than my curiosity. I convinced myself it was just the work of some bored artist, and I had simply freaked myself out by picking up an old animal bone. That was the logical explanation, right? But even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I'm not one to believe in the supernatural. I'd like to think I could handle myself if I had to, but in that moment, every fiber of my being screamed for me to leave and never come back. Weeks later, I did return. It took that long for me to gather the courage, and when I did, it gave whoever had made that strange display enough time to remove it. The tree stump was empty, the turf ball had been cut down, and everything was gone. The place seemed even more unsettling now that it was empty, as if its disappearance made it even more mysterious. I thought maybe some kids had found it and vandalized it, but then I wondered, what if it was my discovery that caused it to be taken down? What if it was destroyed to hide something? What had been going on there, and what was so wrong that they had to erase it? I kicked at the remains of the tree stump, hoping to find one of the bones, but there was nothing. And once again, I felt that eerie sense of being watched. But this time, I backed away without feeling the same level of fear. I finished my walk, but I couldn't help thinking about what I had seen. That strange combination of the turf ball and tree stump remains the oddest, creepiest thing I've encountered on a hike, and probably the creepiest thing I've experienced in my entire life. Sure, on the surface, it looked like a bizarre yet artistic creation. But the more I think about it, the bones, the strange feeling of being watched, and the mystery of who would create such a thing, the more I'm relieved it's gone. Music. On Sunday, May 19, 1996, 26-year-old Carly Winters and 24-year-old Emily Blake embarked on a hiking adventure in the Blue Ridge Mountains, accompanied by Carly's golden retriever, Duke. Emily was from Duluth, Minnesota, while Carly hailed from a small town in rural Maine. Though they came from different backgrounds, both shared a deep love for nature and the outdoors. They had met nearly 2 years prior while volunteering at a now-closed organization in Minnesota that provided wilderness survival training and funded trips for women. Carly Winters, a fan of craft beer and outdoor activities, came from a well-off family in Michigan. After finishing high school, she left home to study wilderness guiding at Unity College in Maine. Carly was passionate about sharing the transformative power of nature with others, hoping to help them find themselves in the wild, just as she had. Emily, on the other hand, was a skilled geologist and former state champion tennis player in Minnesota. She later traveled to Spain to study prehistoric life and the extinction of dinosaurs. After graduating with honors, she found a job at a bookstore in Vermont. Her hiking trip through the mountains was meant to celebrate her new position, as she was set to start work on June 1, 1996. But Emily failed to show up for her first day, and soon, concerns arose. On May 31, 1996, after hearing nothing from Emily for over a week, her father, Thomas Blake, reported the two women missing. A search operation ensued, and the car they had been traveling in was discovered north of a lodge in the mountains. Bridget Arnold, a deputy chief ranger, later recalled that rangers quickly scoured the trails near the lodge. During the search, Carly's dog, Duke, was found roaming the park alone. The following evening, June 1, 1996, rangers discovered the bodies of Carly and Emily near a campsite close to a horse trail. The women had been bound and gagged, with their throats cut. Investigators soon recovered the women's camera, which offered a glimpse into their last days. They had hiked up the White Oak Canyon Trail and had hitched a ride with a ranger after a weather change. Once the skies cleared, they summit Hawksbill Mountain, the highest peak in the region, and set up camp by a peaceful stream. Detectives concluded that hours after taking their final photographs, they were violently killed. The campsite was located only a quarter mile from a popular scenic drive and half a mile from a well-frequented lodge, both of which would have been bustling with tourists and hikers during the Memorial Day weekend. The fact that no one had seen anything was puzzling, but park rules required campers to stay off established trails, which made them vulnerable to a potential killer. Tragically, Emily and Carly were not the first people to vanish in the nation's parks. Getting lost or encountering dangerous animals is not uncommon, but disappearances and murders in these places create a specific type of horror. Sally Montgomery, a park manager, admitted that the case shook everyone who worked there. "We don't have much crime in the park," she said, "but when we found those women, it was terrifying." The FBI joined forces with the Virginia State Police to investigate, but the challenges of working in a national park proved overwhelming. A park ranger explained that with over 1 million visitors each year, the transient nature of park guests made it difficult to pinpoint a suspect. A crime scene in the wild was also much larger than one at a residence, complicating efforts to gather evidence. The search for the killer generated over 15,000 leads, but by the following year, the case seemed to be fading into obscurity. That was until July 1997, when a frightening incident unfolded along Skyline Drive, a popular route in the park. Yvonne Miller, a cyclist from Canada, was forced off the road by a truck driven by a man later identified as Daryl Price. Yvonne said the man shouted obscenities before attempting to force her into his truck. She managed to escape, hiding behind a tree, but the man tried to run her over before fleeing. Park rangers arrested him as he attempted to leave the area. Price, a man in his late 20s from Columbia, Maryland, had no criminal record but had been fired from his job earlier that year due to his volatile behavior. Investigators found zip ties in his vehicle, suggesting he may have been planning to restrain victims. While little was known about Price at the time, interviews revealed concerning patterns of behavior, including a history of threatening and aggressive actions. Price was caught on security footage entering the park around the same time Emily and Carly were there, and his presence near the scene on June 1st raised suspicions. However, despite circumstantial evidence, Price denied being involved. Years passed, and the case went cold, but in 2001, a breakthrough came when the Virginia Attorney General announced that Price had been indicted for the murders. Prosecutors revealed disturbing statements Price had made, including his belief that women were more vulnerable and that the couple had deserved to die because of their sexuality. Despite the charges, the case faltered when DNA testing on evidence failed to match Price to the crime scene. By 2003, forensic tests on a single hair found at the scene confirmed that Price was not the killer, leading investigators to drop their focus on him. The case, however, remains open. As of the 20th anniversary of the crime, the FBI continues to seek information, hoping for a tip that could bring justice to the families of Emily and Carly. If they were still alive today, Emily and Carly would be nearing 50, likely still sharing their love of the outdoors. Their tragic deaths continue to haunt their loved ones and the rangers who worked in the park at the time. "When I learned they were geologists, it really hit home," said one former ranger. "They were out there just enjoying the rocks, and then something horrible happened. It changed the way I did my job and how I thought about the park." 2 decades have passed since Emily and Carly were killed, but their memory lingers in the hearts of those who knew them and those who continue to search for answers. I am a water scientist, which basically means I spent most of my 20s studying water without losing my mind from boredom. Kidding aside, it's actually way more fascinating than people think. If you get a solid degree from a reputable university, the job opportunities are pretty wide-ranging. We help farmers grow crops, ensure water treatment plants deliver clean water, and make sure that water reaches your home, safe and in good supply. We also assess rivers to determine if they can be dammed, aiming to harness green energy without damaging the environment too much. It was one of those assessment projects that led me to the wilderness of northern Washington during the summer of 2016. On paper, it was a sweet deal, a well-paying, high-stakes job that could determine the outcome of a multi-million-dollar government contract. Between you and me, though, it felt more like a paid hiking trip. The plan was simple: explore, examine the terrain, take notes. I estimated the work would take about 5 or 6 days, leaving plenty of time to enjoy the outdoors. I didn't even last 3 days. By the evening of the 3rd day, I was sprinting out of the woods with only my car keys, phone, and a survival knife. Something is seriously wrong in the woods near Colville National Forest, and it's something no one talks about. My first day started in a small town called Cedar Creek. It was a quiet little place with one general store, where I stopped for some last-minute supplies. When I asked the clerk for a safe place to leave my car, he kindly offered the free parking lot behind the store and assured me he'd keep an eye on it while I hiked into the pine-covered hills. The pines I was ready for, the hills not so much. I consider myself pretty fit, but those hills absolutely destroyed me. Even zigzagging up the slopes to ease the climb didn't help much. By the time I reached my first campsite, carrying all my gear felt like punishment. That night, I collapsed into my sleeping bag, completely drained. The second day was more of the same. Aching muscles, drenched in sweat, but I stayed optimistic, telling myself it was the workout of a lifetime. However, the smell. Oh, the smell. I was rank. I considered hiking down to the river to clean up, but I didn't want to get filthy again on the way back. So, I settled for baby wipes and promised myself a proper wash on day 3 when I'd refill my water supplies. On the third morning, I woke up with a pounding headache. I popped a couple of painkillers, laced up my boots, and headed into the trees to take care of nature's call. That's when I noticed something alarming. My pee was dark, like whiskey. I was dehydrated, having rationed my water a bit too carefully. Deciding it was time to fix that, I hiked straight down to the river. I guzzled water until I felt human again, stripped down to my boxers, and waded in for a much-needed rinse. As I was getting out, I thought I saw movement in the trees near where I'd left my clothes. It was subtle, like something brushing against the undergrowth. Maybe a breeze? Or maybe an animal. Spooked but not panicked, I grabbed my stuff and headed back to camp. Later that day, while hiking and taking notes, I caught a horrible stench in the air. At first, I thought it was me, but the further I walked, the stronger it got. Soon, the smell was so overpowering I had to stop to keep from gagging. That's when I saw it. A dead animal hanging in a tree. It was so mangled I couldn't tell if it had been a fox or a coyote. Someone had clearly killed it and strung it up. I assumed it was a crude way to scare off predators, but there weren't any farms around for miles. Then I noticed it wasn't the only one. As I moved, I saw more corpses, raccoons, rabbits, even what looked like half a deer skeleton, strung up in the trees. They were everywhere in various stages of decay. The smell was unbearable, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was surrounded. That was the breaking point. I didn't bother packing up my tent or gear. I just grabbed my essentials and bolted back to the car. I don't like to think about how much money I lost walking away from that job. It doesn't matter. No paycheck would ever convince me to go back to those woods, not after what I saw or what I felt. I studied biology in college, and one semester we had a guest lecturer join us. Her name was instantly recognizable. She was a renowned figure in orangutan conservation. After her lecture, we found out she was looking for 2 students to assist with a year-long research project abroad following graduation. The study would take place in a remote part of Borneo. I had always dreamed of traveling but never had the means, so having everything covered by the research program was a dream come true. Growing up in a small Midwestern town, I couldn't imagine anything more thrilling than venturing to Borneo, a lush tropical island in Southeast Asia, just below the Philippines. The opportunity was incredible, but it was far from easy. We started our days at 3:30 a.m., working 6 days on and 3 days off, spending around 14 to 15 hours daily in the dense, humid rainforest. Our job involved tracking wild orangutans and meticulously recording behavioral data every 2 minutes. Since they were completely wild, we maintained a safe distance and never attempted to touch them, ensuring our presence didn't interfere with their natural routines. That said, I had a few harrowing encounters. Over the course of my year there, I was charged 3 times by a dominant male orangutan. It was terrifying each time, though he never made contact. He only succeeded in making my heart race and my legs sprint. The work was both physically grueling and mentally draining. The constant onslaught of mosquitoes made the experience even more challenging. To top it off, we had no communication with the outside world except during our rare breaks. On those days, we'd trek nearly an hour to a specific spot in the jungle where we could occasionally catch a faint cell signal. Even then, it was barely enough to send a few short messages via WhatsApp. We'd type them out, wait for the signal to cooperate, and send them all at once before switching our phones back to airplane mode to conserve battery life. One morning, after completing our usual routine, we set off into the jungle at sunrise. I was incredibly sleepy, struggling to stay alert, when suddenly I felt a jolt of adrenaline. Ahead of us, crouched low in the undergrowth, was a clouded leopard. The animal was completely still, staring at us with piercing amber eyes. Both I and the other American researcher froze on the spot. Seeing a leopard was an extraordinary rarity, not only because of how endangered they are, but also because they generally avoid humans. At first, I thought it would just run off, but instead, it slowly rose and crept toward us. Fear hit me like a wave. Fortunately, one of our local guides pulled out a slingshot, aimed, and launched a stone near the leopard. The moment the rock landed, the leopard bolted back into the jungle. We stood there, trembling, for what felt like ages before the guide reassured us that it was likely a young leopard, curious about us and probably watching us throughout the night before crossing our path in the morning. If not for our guide's quick action, we might have been in real danger. We continued cautiously, though my nerves were on edge. The dense jungle canopy meant the light was dim even in the morning, with plenty of shadowy pockets among the trees. Feeling uneasy, I took out my flashlight to scan the darker areas. The first spot I checked revealed nothing. The second was clear too, but in the third, there it was. A pair of glowing eyes reflected the beam of my flashlight. I couldn't see the leopard fully, but its unmistakable silhouette was watching us from the shadows. This encounter drove home the risks of working in such an environment. Jungle research can be incredibly dangerous, and predators like big cats are only one of the many hazards. We couldn't safely proceed with a leopard potentially stalking us, especially since they're ambush hunters. Though theoretically, keeping an eye on it should deter an attack, the jungle is their territory, and they're masters of camouflage. One slip-up could have been catastrophic. In the end, the guide's expertise saved us once again, and we eventually managed to leave the area without further incident. That encounter remains the most frightening experience of my time in Borneo, a stark reminder of how unpredictable and unforgiving the wilderness can be. During my college years, I worked at a summer camp for youth explorers. This story happened during the summer after I graduated, making it the last time I ever worked there. Each week, I'd take a group of campers out to a spot in the forest for their wilderness survival badge. The activities included building a shelter out of branches and leaves to sleep in, learning to make a campfire, and cooking food over it. Though the spot felt remote, it was only about half a mile from the main camp, but we'd intentionally lead the campers in circles to make it seem more isolated. One evening, after the kids had built their shelters and we'd finished cooking dinner, we all gathered around the fire to sing songs and tell spooky stories. It was getting late, around 10 p.m., so I sent the campers to their makeshift shelters for the night and began extinguishing the fire as part of our safety procedures. That's when we heard it. A faint chime, like a distant bell. It rang out at intervals every 10 seconds or so, and lasted only a couple of minutes. The sound was subtle but distinct, and everyone, including the kids, noticed it. Since we'd been swapping scary stories, some of the kids started getting nervous, speculating about ghosts or other eerie explanations. I reassured them, saying it was likely just a late-night church service in a nearby town, even though deep down, I was unsettled too. Here's the thing, there wasn't supposed to be any town or church within 20 miles of our camp. I confirmed this later by checking a map and asking an older camp counselor about the area. He said there were no rural churches nearby. When I pressed further, asking why we might hear bells so deep in the forest, he gave me an uncomfortable look before saying he'd heard it before, but that it wasn't anything to worry about. That response actually made me more uneasy than anything else. At the time, I was mostly confused. Our camp was supposed to be well away from civilization. Still, the counselor's acknowledgement of the sound gave me some reassurance, until he abruptly canceled all future wilderness trips the next day. The other counselors were disappointed since the wilderness trips were a highlight of the camp experience, but they accepted it without much fuss. I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on. If the bells were harmless, why cancel the trips? When I asked him about it, he said there had been several recent bear sightings and he didn't want to take any chances. It was a reasonable explanation. Bears were common in northern Idaho, especially after a wet spring, but something about his behavior made me doubt it. No one had reported seeing bears, nor were there any signs like claw marks or droppings. It didn't add up, but I didn't have the time or resources to investigate further. I liked and respected the head counselor and didn't want to accuse him of hiding something without proof. Plus, wandering around the woods alone to solve the mystery didn't seem like the safest idea. I never returned to the camp after that summer, and no incidents involving kids or staff ever occurred. To this day, I've never found an explanation for the eerie chiming or why the trips were abruptly canceled. It remains my go-to creepy story, one that lingers in my memory because it's still a complete mystery, even all these years later. Back in July of 2014, I was on a solo backpacking trip around the Oregon coast. I made stops at several places, including areas near the Clatsop State Forest. A few days into the trip, I stopped in a small town and ended up on a random gravel road that ended at a scenic spot along a riverbank. The view was breathtaking. There was an old wooden bridge crossing the river that looked straight out of a fantasy novel. The summer heat was intense, and after days without a proper wash, I was feeling far from clean. Seeing the cool, clear river in front of me was too tempting. I parked my car at the dead end, turned it around just in case I needed to leave quickly, and grabbed a towel. I didn't have a swimsuit with me, but figured a quick dip in my underwear wouldn't hurt. The area seemed utterly isolated, and I felt safe enough. Yet, as I approached the river, a faint unease started to creep in. A sense that something about this situation wasn't right. People always talk about the feeling of being watched, and while I'm not usually paranoid, I couldn't shake the discomfort. I brushed the feeling off as irrational and stepped into the river. The water was refreshing, and I started scrubbing off days of sweat and grime, but the unease lingered. After a few minutes, I decided to cut the bath short. As I walked up the embankment to where I'd left my towel and clothes, the unsettling feeling faded a little. Then I saw him. Across the river, slightly uphill from me, stood a man. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but no, it was a person. His clothing looked like it was handmade from animal hides, and his hair was long and matted, with strands tangled around twigs. He looked like he lived entirely off the land. We locked eyes, and my skin crawled. His presence wasn't just startling, it was menacing. Without saying a word, he began moving toward the bridge that spanned the river. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my shoes, towel, and car keys, but my clothes got caught in some brambles. Realizing I didn't have time, I left the clothes behind and bolted toward my car. As I scrambled through the blackberry bushes, I could hear him crossing the bridge. Reaching my car, I threw the door open and locked it just as he arrived. He slammed his hands against the hood, screaming and grunting incoherently. When he moved toward the driver's side door, I hit the gas and sped off. In the rearview mirror, I saw him chasing after the car, his figure growing smaller as I gained distance. He pursued me for nearly a mile before vanishing from sight. I was bleeding from scratches, soaked, and trembling as I drove away. Even now, years later, I can still feel the terror of that moment. I truly believed I was being hunted. I've never returned to that area, and I never hike alone anymore. That day changed me forever, and though therapy has helped, the memory is still vivid. I've spent most of my life living in the Appalachians, always in pretty remote areas. It's always peaceful, quiet, and surrounded by forests. One evening, a few years ago, I was sitting on my porch around midnight, sipping a beer and soaking in the stillness of the night. If you've never lived out in the countryside during summer, you might not realize how noisy nature can be after dark. The crickets chirp, frogs croak, and occasionally, you'll catch the sounds of other wildlife. It's like nature's version of a sound machine. Sometimes it's calming, but other times, the wild throws something at you that'll send chills down your spine. So, this one particular night, I'm just sitting there, beer in hand, with the constant hum of the woods in the background. Suddenly, everything stopped. The noise didn't fade out gradually. It just ceased all at once, as if someone had hit a mute button. The quiet was so thick that you could hear a leaf fall yards away. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the most horrifying sound I've ever experienced. It came from about 20 or 30 feet ahead of me in the trees. It was an ear-piercing, blood-freezing scream, like nothing I'd heard before. I knew it wasn't a cougar or anything like that. I've heard those before, and they tend to avoid human activity. This scream had something eerily human about it, yet I was certain no person could make a sound like that, at least not a sane one. I didn't stick around to investigate. I calmly got up, walked into the house, and stationed myself by the front window with my shotgun within arm's reach. I sat there, keeping an eye on the yard, until I eventually drank enough to stop feeling scared. That was the first and only time I ever heard a sound like that, and I sincerely hope I never hear it again. Some folks have suggested it could have been a large owl, since they're known to make some unsettling noises at night. But I'm telling you, there's no way that was an owl. Whatever it was, it sounded massive, not like a bird. It didn't repeat the cry either. It let out one long, haunting scream and then moved off into the woods. Unless we've got some kind of mutant owl that moves on 4 legs or 2, it wasn't a bird. I don't live in that area anymore, and honestly, I'm grateful. Whatever came that close to me that night, I hope it stays far, far away from where I am now.